Thank you guys for joining us, and to those who might be joining in from the Facebook live stream, welcome as well. As you guys know, this presentation is being hosted by the Palestinian Youth Movement and the Dallas Anti-War Committee. We'll be going through a brief overview of Zionism, a little bit about Zionist propaganda, and then a discussion on state repression and how to protect ourselves. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Nida, and I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement. The PYM is a transnational, independent grassroots movement of young diaspora Palestinian and Arab youth dedicated to the liberation of Palestine. We have chapters all across occupied Turtle Island and in Europe, and I'm with the Dallas chapter. I'm super excited to be here today, and I'll very briefly pass it on to Josh, who will introduce themselves and then tell us a little bit about the Dallas Anti-War Committee, as well as go through some ground rules.
Thank you. So yeah, my name is Josh. I'm with the Dallas Anti-War Committee. We are a local anti-imperialist organization that primarily works in Dallas, although we are growing pretty rapidly across DFW at the moment. And so I just wanted to welcome us in with a few just sort of ground rules, if we can call them those. So if folks wouldn't mind editing your screen name to include name, it can just be your first name if you'd like, and your pronouns. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. In general, we would love for the chat to be an active place tonight, for people to communicate, share their experiences, as well as drop questions. We are dropping in the chat regularly just a welcome message that has at the bottom a tiny URL. Please respond to the discussion questions. That would be helpful for us to get a sense of where people are coming from. We're going to respond to questions as well tonight. We're going to do our best to get to as many as we can in the time that we have, but we're going to respond to others in our follow-up email. So in the poll, be sure to include your email and you'll get access to all of the follow-up information that we're going to give. So thank you all so much for coming tonight, and I'm going to pass it over to Nida for the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Josh. So I'm gonna get started off with we're starting off really basic here. But before I get started in defining Zionism, I just want to make it very clear that everything we're going through is kind of a bit surface level today. And there's much more to be said about the history and evolution of the modern Zionist ideology and political movement. And as mentioned in our messages that we circulated prior to the webinar, we will be sharing some political education resources with the attendees tonight. So, if it seems like we're skimming over, especially my part of the presentation, a few things, we definitely have an understanding that these are very in-depth topics, but we just want to keep our presentation tonight on the briefer end. So with that said, I want to start off by just providing a definition for Zionism. So Zionism is more than just a belief in a Jewish state, as some might try to make it seem. Rather, it's a settler colonial movement and a fascist ideology that was born in the late 1800s in Europe. It was a movement led by upper class Jewish individuals in Europe who partnered with European powers to gain their support. It believes in establishing a Jewish supremacist state in historic Palestine, and that becomes achievable using means of oppression, including apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. So the ultimate objective of Zionism is to establish a Jewish state on the ruins and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinian people. And keeping in mind, of course, that this is the time of European hegemony and European colonialism was thriving all around the world. So that is where this ideology comes from. And it's comparable to many forms of other European colonialism around the world. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So when we say that Zionism is a settler colonial project, what do we really mean by that? And I suppose it's important to differentiate settler colonialism from other forms of colonialism that have existed and that existed and continue to exist today. But just for a simple definition, settler colonialism is the form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of a colonized territory with a new society of settlers. And often over time, as in the occupied Turtle Island, these invasive settler societies developed a distinct identity and sovereignty. So settler colonialism functions on the idea of a logic of elimination. which is the logic that settlers needed to develop not only the moral justification for the removal of natives, but also the practical means to ensure its success. In this next slide, we have a few quotes from some of the more prominent founders and leaders of the Zionist movement. And really, I included these here so that we can hone in on what the logic of elimination that we discussed in the previous slide really means, and what does it look like being adopted in this context, right? So a quote by David Ben-Gurion says, "With compulsory transfer, we would have a vast area for settlements. I support compulsory transfer, and I don't see anything immoral in it." And then in another quote, Vladimir, I forgot how to say the last name, I'm sorry, says that Zionism is a colonization adventure and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed forces. It is important to speak Hebrew, but unfortunately, it is even more important to be able to shoot, or else I am through with playing at colonizing. And then by Joseph Weitz, he says, "Between ourselves, it must be clear that there is no room for both peoples together in this country. There is no other way than to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left." And that is exactly this, the founders of Zionism embodied this logic of elimination. We cannot exist with them on this land, and therefore we must push them out. We must kill them. We must get rid of them from this space in order for us to exist as a settler colony on this land. So I think we can go to the next slide. So moving on, I want to go over some tactics that are utilized to justify and normalize the Zionist ideology and the practices of the Zionist entity / Israel, right? So to get us started, it's important to recognize that there are three main types of Zionist actors that we will discuss today in the presentation. The first is openly Zionist government and civil institutions. So we're thinking Israeli government, right, and the institutions that fall under the Israeli government. The second is Zionist supporters in the media. So we're thinking about popular news outlets that have and are currently perpetuating false Zionist narratives, such as CNN, Fox News, etc. And thirdly, Western government supporters of Zionism, of which, of course, the United States is perhaps the most prominent supporter of Zionism. And the tactics we'll be discussing are, one, the use of Zionist propaganda, which encompasses framing and disinformation, the framings that Zionists use and the disinformation that the Zionist entity very purposefully dispels to the masses. And then the second is the use of state repression, which encompasses splitting, disorienting, harassing, and infiltration. And we will be covering these two things more in depth in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Before we delve in any further, I want to just kind of ground us and emphasize that having these discussions and becoming aware of the tactics used by the Zionist entities really for the sake of our own empowerment. So the objective is never for us to walk away after gaining like some new understanding, feeling helpless or powerless. All these tactics used by the State of Israel can be fought back against, and that's why we're doing this presentation today. And just some of the tools that are at our disposal include media literacy skills, clear and cohesive messaging, effective security culture, which Josh will go over, uniting as a movement, and mutual support and solidarity. We often say this at our protests, but it's really more than just a chant. But together, the people united, we can never be defeated. And we have to really embody that sort of revolutionary optimism in all of our spaces. Next slide, please. So I'll start off my discussion by briefly talking about the tactics and use of Zionist propaganda, which can be divided into two main aspects: framing and disinformation. When we think about framing, I want us to think about story choices. So through traditional media, there's always a decision being made behind the scenes, right, on which stories to tell and how to tell them, and which stories to gloss over and suppress. So Zionist framing starts when stories are pitched and selected. So it's always important for us to engage critically when we are, reading stories from the news, and think to ourselves, what is the story trying to portray? Does it show Palestinians telling their own stories on their own terms? Is it empowering or traumatizing? And again, here, what we really want to hone in here is that there is a very active choice being made of which stories we want to tell. And it's never a coincidence. So engaging very critically with what we're consuming is critical for us to be able to recognize Zionist propaganda and Zionist framing when we see it. And just kind of like, as always, it's important for us to remember that we can uplift Palestinian voices, especially on social media now. Social media has become a very powerful tool. So I hope that in the past few months, and I hope that we will continue, posting from on the ground folks in Gaza and Palestinian organizers near you. So to the next slide, please. So now that the story is chosen, the next step becomes, well, how will it be told, right? And oftentimes, pro-Zionist media will use certain language that normalizes the occupation and genocide of Palestine. Or on the flip side, it delegitimizes and dehumanizes Palestinian people. Oftentimes, these two things occur together. I didn't mean to say on the flip side. But sometimes it's more overt or covert, right? And they, furthermore, the media often reports Zionist narratives as they are being told by the Israeli military or Israeli government officials themselves, as if those sources are ones of undoubted truth. Everything they say is accepted as described here wholesale, and that comes at the cost of burying or casting doubt on Palestinian narratives. And lastly, and we've seen this, I know we've all seen, so many interviews going around social media, going viral right now, just pointing out the difference in framing and language that's being used by popular media outlet reporters. When Zionist frameworks are accepted as truth, and Palestinian experiences are often considered biased. And it's very reflective in the way that they ask questions, the way that they conduct themselves, and what they accept at face value as true, and what they choose to cast doubt on in the process of interviewing a Palestinian diplomat versus an Israeli diplomat, or a Palestinian individual or a pro-Zionist individual. Next slide, please. So another part of a framing is understanding the basis of the lies and propaganda that is being pushed out. And for Zionist frameworks and popular arguments, in many, and some may say vast majority of cases, the popular arguments being used today are based on some sort of Islamophobic rhetoric, right? And if I wanted to include this quote because I think it really brings this all home, but in the words of Professor Hatem Beizan, it is clear that Islamophobia in Israel is Israel's public relations go-to strategy, and the attempts to create 99 degrees of connection between Palestinian advocates in the US and Hamas is the preferred PR strategy. The media and US politicians who have deeply formed Islamophobic worldview are spoon-fed this narrative, and every outlandish Israeli lie and claim is taken as a fact to be acted upon. Islamophobia is deadly and has been deployed before to push for war and intervention. Israel is deploying Islamophobia in support of the Gaza genocide. And this is written very recently, specifically it's written in context of the ongoing attacks on the student movement, specifically on Students for Justice in Palestine groups all across the nation. And this attempt to really vilify them by tying them to Islamophobic rhetoric and tropes. And that is the primary way that they are using to suppress these students on campus. And we've seen it come to life in many different ways. For example, recently, Students for Justice in Palestine, along with the Jewish Voice for Peace at Columbia University, were actually were kind of banned from their campus for the next academic school year. And that's because of a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric that's being pushed out and the associations that are attempted to be made between these groups and groups overseas. Next slide, please. So here we have a video by Mohammed Kurd, and we thought it was really great to include. It goes over media literacy, so I'll just stop talking and let Mohammed Kurd talk.
Hi, let's do a quick media literacy lesson. Who controls the NHS? The UK. Who controls the French Department of Health? French government. You get the point. So let's ask ourselves a question. Why is it that when mainstream news networks are referring to hospitals or schools in the Gaza Strip, they will often say Hamas run? Regardless of what you may think of it, Hamas is the governing body in the Gaza Strip, and so logically, the Ministry of Health would be under its jurisdiction. Phrases like Hamas run and Hamas controlled are irrelevant, but they are designed to feed on your bias. You then start to become apathetic to these patients that lie sick in those hospitals. You dehumanize them and you think of them as less worthy victims. Such phrases cast doubt on the data coming out of these institutions, and they portray these institutions not as medical institutions run by healthcare professionals, but rather scary, untrustworthy institutions run by savages. When it comes to Israeli death, a journalist can just say X amount of Israelis have been confirmed killed. As for Palestinian death, the sentence will become the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza says that X amount of Palestinians have died. This is one of the many ways totalitarianism operates within Western media to dehumanize Palestinians. But remember, a hospital is a hospital. Language is a minefield. It has significant influence on how we think and what we believe. But remember to be critical. You do not have to be complicit in genocide.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think that video is so important. And that's a way that like framing really comes to life, right? And I think what's really important here is to just recognize that the purpose of this, the purpose of all of this really is to normalize Zionist frameworks, right? And so by accepting and reporting Zionist narratives wholesale, the media normalizes and legitimizes what is at its core an incredibly violent, inhumane, and illegal occupation of Palestine. And so this is a reminder for ourselves that we never accept Zionist news or media that might be appearing as liberal, but really is Zionist, to set the tone for us. And we do that by always centering Palestinian stories, Palestinian histories, realities, and vision. So when we speak or post about Palestine, we need to start from a place of accepting that Palestine is under settler colonial rule by the Zionist entity. And that Palestinians have a right to liberation and self-determination, and Palestinians, the diaspora, have a right to return to their homes. So when we accept these as basic, as kind of basic parameters for how we engage with this, as for the way we think about Palestine, I think it really informs the way we engage with media and the way and what media we choose to share and push out. So can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So I wanted us to kind of think about some actual lies that have been told in recent history. I think we learn best through examples. So some Zionist disinformation campaigns, right? So I just wanted to talk about a few recent ones. So very recently, we've seen videos that very clearly show Israel's use of white phosphorus, which is a violation of international law. I mean, these videos are being posted by Palestinians in Gaza on the ground, and we can very clearly see that it is white phosphorus. Yet the Israeli government has come out to say that they have not used white phosphorus. And in fact, an instance, the United States confirmed that as well. Even though we see these videos, it's still like, oh, we did not do this. And then it was the claims about beheading children or beheading babies. I know we all sort of remember, when news first broke out in October 7th and 8th, and it was a lot of like, and 40 Israeli babies were beheaded, and at first that seemed, I mean, at face value, that seemed like a very like big claim, but whenever we saw even Joe Biden himself confirm that, I think that's where we see why some people fall victim to some of these lies, right? And then, of course, the claims about rape that have not been confirmed, and then lying about the deadly airstrikes on if hospitals and schools that should be safe for civilians. The entire strip should be safe, of course. But and then lastly, another one that's kind of outside of the current genocide on Gaza, but lying about the murder of the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, right? I think it was made abundantly clear, and Palestinian reporting came out from the very first day that she was shot and killed by a soldier. Yet Israel continued to deny it, and the United States continued to stand with Israel, claiming that there still needs to be an investigation done. And that way, they put on this whole campaign of, we don't know if it was the Israeli soldiers or not who shot her, and distracted the world for 9 months until the military came out and said, yeah, it was an IOF soldier who accidentally shot her. So they use these disinformation campaigns to obviously spread lies, but also distract the public from the truth and from what's actually going on. So on this next slide, we formed this like disinformation pipeline. So to talk a little bit about how these stories are made and envision the way they are created and then spread. So one of the worst examples of this pipeline is, again, the recent lie about the decapitated babies. So on October 10th, Ben Zion, a settler Israeli occupation force soldier who has repeatedly called for genocide, made that claim. And then the claim was reported as disproven the same day. However, Netanyahu, the prime minister of the Zionist entity, his office made that claim publicly. So this is kind of the first day that this claim is being made. And then on October 11th, we see that President Biden makes the claim that he actually saw the pictures during a televised national address, right? So if folks were at first, maybe the general American public, not sure of whether this was true or not, they just saw the president of their country in front of the entire world say that he saw pictures of these decapitated babies, right? And then October 12th, the claim is quietly retracted by the White House, but not by President Biden directly. But at this point, the world had already accepted this as a true, as truth, as fact, and therefore, whatever retaliation was being perpetuated by Israel was justified. It's like, well, there were babies murdered and beheaded, and the president of the United States described seeing those pictures, and therefore the retaliation, like, Israel is justified in the way it's acting. And that's when we start to think about manufacturing consent. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the purpose of these lies is to manufacture consent in the public for genocide, right? And we've seen this before. I mean, with the claims of nuclear power in Iraq as a means to justify the atrocities that the U.S. committed there. And so, but unlike 2003, the entire world has access to Palestinians in Gaza posting their stories. And we can see through Zionist propaganda, which is really why media literacy and centering Palestinian voices is incredibly important during this time. And then next slide, please. So just keeping in mind that we, again, are not powerless. We said this earlier in the presentation, but we don't have to accept Zionist framings in our media. We must uplift Palestinian voices and organizers in the movement, whether on social media or in real life when we talk to friends and family. Again, being mindful of the language we're using, being mindful of what stories we're accepting as facts, and knowing when to engage with a Zionist is so important. So when you post or talk about Palestine, remember that we are all a part of shaping the narrative. And what we're witnessing right now is actually a popular shift in the way people are talking about Palestine in the West. And that is so exciting, but we can't let it end where it is right now. You know, when ceasefire is called, it doesn't end there. We're going to begin pushing Palestinian stories. We're going to continue pushing Palestinian stories so that we can push the demands that come beyond a ceasefire, right? So ending the occupation, lifting the siege on Gaza, you know, the right of Palestinians to return, all of that. It becomes a part of the popular narrative when we continue to push it. So with that said, I think the next part of the presentation goes to you, Josh. Thank you guys so much. Go ahead, Josh.
Thank you very much, Nida, for taking that first part of the presentation and doing a phenomenal job of talking about, you know, the background on Zionism and the propaganda used. This next section is largely about state repression tactics, but not all of these things are exclusive to tactics that the state uses. Some of these are things that Zionists also use to try and mess up, disorient, destroy our movement. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, these are some of the topics that I think are really important, especially for people who are coming into organizing maybe for the first time. But we're going to talk a little bit about splitting, disorienting, harassing, and infiltrating, and kind of what those mean. The goal from this section that I really want to get across is the difference between security and security theater. So that way we're not being, you know, sort of petrified and stalled from our organizing work because we're scared of these things, but also not implementing useless strategies that aren't actually effective. We want to make sure that we're, you know, keeping ourselves, our communities, and our movement safe and moving forward. So there's a long history of these tactics being used against movements. And so we're going to be pulling some of this information from things like COINTELPRO, which formerly was from, you know, the 1950s to the 1970s, was a program by the FBI to groups like the Black Panther Party, the Indian movement, labor organizations, all kinds of left or human rights groups that were threatening the status quo. We also are pulling from some of the lessons learned from the Black Lives Matter movement from 2020 in particular. And we'll be talking a little bit about a story from Denver there that is, I think, relevant to what we're going to be talking about. And ultimately, you know, we can learn from this history, we can see these patterns, and we can use them to make calculated decisions as we move forward together. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was splitting. So, you know, splitting is the intentional attempt to break apart the movement into feuding factions for the sake of stalling its momentum. So basically, it's whenever people are trying to break us apart into whatever different groups they can, so we're not working together, so we're not united. So I just want to read this quote. This is directly from the COINTELPRO handbook, from one of their memorandums internally. So the purpose: to recommend attached item be given news media source on confidential basis as counterintelligence measure to help neutralize extremist Black Panther and Panthers and foster split between them and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So the purpose of this is to split between these two groups. So what they said is there's a feud between the two most prominent Black nationalist extremist groups, the Black Panthers and SNCC. Attached item notes that the feud is being continued by SNCC circulating the statement that, according to zoologists, the main difference between a panther and other large cats is that the panther has the smallest head. This is biologically true. Publicity to this effect might help neutralize Black Panther recruiting efforts. So this is from the FBI, and this is what they were saying. They created this narrative and spread it amongst people to try and split these two groups. They're literally creating a little slogan that can be used against the Black Panthers, not in the attempt of helping the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to stop racism, but to break apart these two groups, defeat the movement, stall it, pull the power out of it. People are focused on the feud. They're not focused on the goals of the movement. So right now, in particular, with regards to Palestine, we're seeing attempts to pit marginalized communities against one another. In particular, we're seeing a lot of attempts to separate off queer and trans people away from this movement. There's a lot of pinkwashing of the imperialism that Israel commits against Palestinians. There's this sense that's perpetuated in the media that falsely that Israel is this perfect queer and trans utopia, which it is not. And even if it was, that does not justify the genocide being committed against Palestinians. Queer and trans Palestinians, straight and cis Palestinians, all Palestinians. And that is the primary focus that we need to be working on. There's also attempts to separate off Jewish folks by this very incredibly anti-Semitic claim that Zionists have that all Jewish people need to have this dual loyalty to the state of Israel. And, that is in and of itself creating this anti-Semitic narrative that, Jewish people are just off serving Israel. They're not, working towards, the betterment of their communities where they are. These are all attempts to break us apart from each other, and they rely on queer and transphobic and anti-Semitic language and narratives in and of themselves. There's also a lot of attempts to pull apart women and feminists away from this movement. Things like the lies that are being spread around the rapes on October 7th or the decapitations of babies. These kinds of lies are particularly geared towards pulling away feminists away from this movement. And we need to recognize that women, girls, non-binary folks, queer and trans people, everyone in Gaza right now is facing these bombs, facing this genocide. And we all need to be focused on stopping the genocide, working to stop this occupation, stopping the apartheid, all of the settler colonialism that comes with the Zionist project. There's also a lot of splits along lines of respectability politics. So people focusing on nuance and semantics and slogans instead of the continuation of the movement. Right now, we're seeing this with just debates around from the river to the sea. And similarly, we saw this in 2020 with just debates constantly, one after the other, around the phrase defund the police. And the purpose of this isn't actually to talk about what these slogans or phrases mean. It's to stall the movement and pull the energy out of it. If we're focused on what the slogan is, we're not focused on the drive of what we're trying to accomplish, which is the material conditions that people are facing. We're working on fixing those material conditions, not on some slogan and how we're branding it. The next tactic that we're going to talk about is disorienting. So disorienting is the act of intentionally creating a sense of confusion among the movement to break down communication. So these are things that all of us can do to different degrees unintentionally, especially people who are just entering organizing. And, these are just mistakes that we all kind of make. But these are also things that the state has said before through COINTELPRO, as well as other counterintelligence campaigns, that they do this in the movement. They spread disinformation. They spread wrong meeting times. They spread incorrect links. They spread anything that they can to confuse people and muddy the waters. So this can include sending unnecessary messages and chats to drown out important information, spreading incorrect information, especially online, to confuse people, reopening finished conversations to prevent conclusive decision-making. So if someone just keeps on bringing up the same completed conversation over and over again, like these are some of the things that are used against us. Some of it happens broadly in the on social media, in the general atmosphere. Sometimes we're going to talk a little bit around infiltration. So that is something that can happen. And as we're talking about all these things, again, we want to talk about, we're learning the patterns, learning the tools that are used against us, not to scare us away from this work, but to better inform us. So that way we can move forward safely, more collectively, and keep the momentum of this movement going. Because our goal is, like I said, working on these material conditions that Palestinians are facing, this genocide right now and the ongoing occupation. We're not looking just for the, to be a part of this movement just all the media narrative is ongoing around it right now. We're looking to keep going and build this up until we have material change that we see. And so these are the, some of the things that we're kind of learning about. And then we're going to talk some more about what we can do to keep ourselves and our communities safe. So one big example I think of disorienting right now is with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So, just briefly on sort of what that is. It is a targeted campaign that is collective and coordinated to boycott, meaning to not purchase goods that are made by Israeli corporations or by corporations that support the occupation of Palestine. Divesting from sources that so boycott is more on the individual level. Divestment happens at a slightly more institutional level. And so that is divesting away. So pulling away from any support that your organization or institution gives to Israeli companies or companies that support the occupation. And sanctions happens at an scale, at the governmental scale, of placing direct sanctions on these corporations, individuals, politicians, and the Zionist entity in and of itself. This works when it is targeted and coordinated. And so you'll see on the left, a non-targeted consumer boycott is what happens when everyone on social media is just kind of posting, oh, boycott this company, and there's no cohesive response. What is more effective is when we are targeted together, the same, few small targets that are reasonable and calculated. I'd encourage you to go to the bdsmovement.net website to learn a lot more on this. So sort of the way that this goes into disorienting is right now on social media, there's a lot of calls for boycotting a bunch of different companies. And they talk a lot on their website about what the goals are. So there's consumer boycott targets that are what we are looking to boycott as consumers, individuals. Divestment targets, again, this is more for like organizations or schools or local governments, businesses. Pressure targets. So these are important to note because Amazon, it's not really feasible for us to boycott Amazon at the moment. A large percentage of Amazon's money comes through their web services, and it's not easy to figure out which website is hosted by them. So that's not a reasonable boycott target is what, BDS movement has determined, but it is a pressure target that we want to put pressure on because they are working on projects like Project Nimbus that directly surveils Palestinians and contributes to the occupation. And then there's organic boycott targets. So these are things that, just community members have started boycotting, but there's not a call from the BDS movement to actually boycott. And this is the area where there are plenty of genuine people trying to work on this and just calling for, random boycotts. There are purposeful disorienting targets that are trying to distract us from the really meaningful boycott targets that can be effective and trying to split that up and disorient us. The next topic I want to talk about is harassing. So this is one that we have seen, and this is not just from state forces especially, but also from, Zionist institutions and individuals. So harassing is a tool used by both state and individual actors to silence the movement by creating an atmosphere of fear. So this can include harassment through the legal system. So this can be, placing or arresting organizers, which, can happen in some ways. We've seen it, in the past, especially with like the Holy Land Foundation and Richardson, which was raided in an attempt to stop their organizing work, helping Palestinians on the ground. It also involves a lot of like vigilante harassment. So doxing, we've seen that recently with large Zionist organizations renting billboards and driving around college campuses with the pictures and phone numbers and information about Palestinian organizers and students. So, that is one thing. Bad jacketing as well. So doxing is the spreading of people's personal information to intimidate them. Bad jacketing is spreading false, negative disinformation about a person to cast them in a negative light. So that's not saying that, everyone who is ever connected with the Palestinian movement is always perfect and you can never call anyone out for when they do something wrong. That's not what that's saying. But what it is saying is that the state has released through their manuals, such as COINTELPRO, that one of their tactics is to send out negative information about people. We saw this in the Black nationalist movement in the 70s, in particular 60s, 70s, whenever the media would release false stories about MLK, for example. And it was later discovered that a lot of those stories were written by FBI agents for the purpose of casting a negative light on the movement, just by spreading disinformation about people. So we see, as I was saying, in particular, doxing being an issue. So we're going to talk a little bit later about security and what we can do to kind of mitigate some of these risks, and also identifying different individuals have different levels of personal risk. So part of security practice is identifying what your risk is, and then taking steps accordingly to protect yourself. So the final tactic that I want to talk about is infiltrating. So this is something that can happen. Infiltration is the deceptive entry by government or Zionist actors into our movement to try and reveal information and destroy us from within. So this is a tactic that is used to this day. It's not, always the case, but it can happen. I want to highlight this podcast if folks want to, listen to this outside of this webinar, by the Alphabet Boys. It is a journalist talking about a specific infiltration into the Black Lives Matter movement in Denver in 2020. It outlines a lot of what the FBI did to send an operative into the movement. It talks a lot about what the tactics they used were. And I think that it's really telling about sort of how this actually works on the ground, because I think that it's easy to kind of get this sense of, what an undercover agent might look like from media that we see. But I think it's important to ground ourselves in the reality of like how these things work. So one big lesson is that, a lot of what the undercover agents did in Denver was just send new people into the movement to try and escalate things randomly. So they would message in group chats, hey, who wants to, commit a crime? And then they would get people who thumbs up that and talk to them individually and try and convince them and give them the tools to do things that they wouldn't have done in the first place, so they can frame them and get them arrested. So, that's an extreme example, but, a smaller example is people entering a big group chat and, being able to shot things. So these, again, are things that shouldn't scare us away from organizing. It's things that should just tell us to think a little bit more about, who we post or how we post, and, who we're working with as well. Okay, so, on that note, how we can stay strong. So the goal of these repression tactics is to slow our movement. So don't let this information scare you away from organizing or make you unnecessarily paranoid. So, you can organize and be involved in this movement very safely. I would say in particular, with the Palestinian movement, there is such a large mass characteristic of people of all age groups, people of all backgrounds involved in this that makes it so much safer. Having, parents and children and elderly folks and kids and, all age groups involved in this work shows that this is a broad swath of society that is demanding this. So we want to keep that momentum going. We want to feel safe bringing our community into this movement. The way we can fight back against these tactics is building collective unity amongst ourselves and effective security culture. So if we learn these patterns and stick together, we can keep each other safe, we can keep our movement safe, we can keep our communities safe, and we can keep building forward for the future. So this is one example of sort of that unity building that we can do. So the St. Paul Principles was something that was proposed in 2020 in St. Paul among different groups working under the umbrella of the Black Lives Matter movement. So basically, it was just 4 general principles for people to work under as this coalition was forming of a broad swath of society that we're all working together for this movement together. So what these, principles that they suggested were number 1, our solidarity will be based on respect for a diversity of tactics and the plans of other groups. So recognize that under the very broad banners of Black Lives Matter or Stop Killer Cops, different groups and individuals organize in different ways. Groups have different tactics, goals, and messages. You don't have to participate in actions you don't support, but treat them with tolerance and respect. So this is meaning in this movement, we're all working against this genocide. And so there's going to be different kind of levels of action. Some of them are going to be protests. Some of them are going to be city council meetings. We're going to be doing all kinds of different things to push this more movement forward. If you, are disagree with one tactic or another, as long as we're all moving together towards the same goal, we can respect that other people are working in different ways. 2, the actions and tactics used will be organized to maintain a separation of time or space. So do not disrupt others' actions. This can keep family-friendly spaces separate from those with a risk of arrest. When sharing a time and location, come to an agreement on actions with the organizers. If not in agreement, do your actions at a different time or place. So for example, this is a way to keep ourselves and our communities safe. If you're doing actions with different levels of arrest, so maybe a direct action versus a rally on the side of the street, keep those at a different date, a different time, different place. So we're keeping people safe. We don't want to create a risk of getting people arrested unnecessarily. And we want to make sure that other groups and other organizations that are planning things aren't being trampled over, aren't being disrupted by people within our movement. 3, any debates or criticisms will stay internal to the movement, avoiding any public or media denunciations of fellow activists or events. So there's some caveats to this. Public dispute in the media and on social media hurts organizing and helps our adversaries. Authorities use disputes, rumors, bad jacketing, drama-inducing interlopers to destroy movements. Our goals are more important than most grievances. Activist disagreement should be worked out privately between activists. Most agree, this is important, that individuals doing active harm to community members are an exception. So this is important that people who are honestly and genuinely working within this movement, we want to assume that as best we can, people are coming from a good intention, that people in this movement are trying to keep this movement going forward. And if we disagree with them, we can talk it through internally and not blow it up, make a big deal, split our organization apart. Now, the big exception to this is active harm to the community members. So if someone is, perpetuating harm, for example, sexual harassment, or, Zionist posts or things like that, that are actively harmful, we absolutely need to address that head on. And 4, we oppose any state repression of dissent, including surveillance, infiltration, disruption, and violence. We agree not to assist law enforcement actions against activists and others. Don't be a snitch. Don't share plans with authorities. Don't trust cops to protect us. Unless you are assigned to do so by lead tactical during a protest, never ever respond to questions from law enforcement. So basically, we're not here to hurt others in the movement. We're not here to police each other. The police have enough money. They have enough people working on them. We don't need to contribute to them by telling the police about what someone else is doing in our movement. So again, these are just suggestions that were brought up in 2020 in St. Paul. It's just a framework that, can be a starting ground for thinking about ways that we can work together as a movement respect each other's actions, even when there's disagreement, keep the momentum going together in a coordinated manner. So we're not letting other people split us up and make us ineffective at what we're trying to do. So some more tips for folks and ways that we can combat these tactics, not just let them get us down. When you're consuming media. So, remember the video from Mohammed El Kurd earlier. We're going to have some other folks that you can follow on social media and in news sources as well later on. But remember that everyone comes from a place of bias. Every post, every news story, everything. So if a story seems to be justifying the genocide, then the storyteller, the person who's writing that, is probably trying to manufacture your consent through their framing of their story, the words they use, the perspectives they use, and it's outright lies. So, just keep in mind that there are people trying to justify this genocide right now. There are a lot of them on mainstream news outlets, and recognize where their bias is coming from, and recognize that there's no perfect middle ground as kind of people try to frame things as. There's no both sidesism. This is a genocide or not a genocide, and we need to come down on the side of stopping this genocide immediately. So pay attention to who you're helping to platform. There's a lot of people who are just trying to get notoriety, trying to chase clout through organizing right now. They want to be the next big name on Palestine because it's the topic of the day. You see these people jumping from cause to cause just so they can gain some, personal power in some way. We're a movement. We're here, organizations, organizers, not build anyone's individual brand. So, when you're producing media, when you're posting on social media, or even when you're just talking with people about Palestine, connect what you're saying to concrete calls to action. So we don't want to just talk about it vaguely and say, here's what's going on. We want to build the people power through getting people connected to bigger organizations, actions. So in your posts, think about including a link to an organization's website or their social media handle. Put a petition link in for something, or drop the information for an upcoming protest near you. These are things that you can do when you're posting or talking about Palestine that don't just end it with a conversation. It invites people forward to keep building. And when you are responding, try not to respond emotionally to Zionists and trolls online. There is an entire, paid ecosystem of people that the Israeli surveillance industry pays to post online. There's also a lot of people who are just Zionists and will go online and fight with you. We're never going to, stop that. And I think that sometimes some people, especially folks who are newer to organizing, have a tendency to give them a show, to, respond in all these ways that, are emotional or aggressive, that are just instantly used against them. So, you can either ignore them or you can think about it and respond with truth to power. So we are on the right side of this. We're calling for a morally and just thing that is founded in the material conditions of the Palestinian people. So we can use that truth. We are speaking from a position of moral authority in this. So, you can either ignore that, ignore the trolls, or you can, respond from that. Try not to just give them a show. And this also goes when you're being interviewed. There's a lot of gotcha questions that will just be thrown at you because they want a clip, they want a soundbite, they want to make you look a certain way. Don't give them that. Don't fall into their framework. Don't fall into their narrative. Share the truth that, it involves learning and growing on, learning about what is going on right now, but being able to respond from that point of truth. So some security tips. Careful about what you post online and send in messages. This is one of the biggest ones. Use encrypted messaging apps like Signal when you're discussing organizing plans, but be thoughtful about what you send in any app. Always assume that there's someone who is going to be able to see that you don't want them to see. Think about what your level of personal risk is with your school, job, family, and plan accordingly. So consider using an initials or an alias or your first name on social media or in interviews. especially if you need to protect yourself from doxing. Different people have different risk levels. Some people's jobs are really at risk for them if they are, accused of being anti-Semitic just because they support Palestine. Some people are more safe in their positions. So kind of, in whatever way. So that's kind of something that for people to individually think about and, use their safety that way accordingly. Think about the sensitivity of information and restrict it accordingly. So we don't want to go on the security theater side and over restrict what we share. So for example, something that's completely legal, like having a rally in a park. We want the community to come to that. We want that to be an engaging event for people to show out and show their voices. So we don't want to, require that you download Signal to get, information about a big open action. We want to spread that. But information that we do want to keep internal, like who's in what organization or plans for more escalating actions or meetings or notes or things like that. Keep them with only the people who need to know them, lock them if you can, to, just send it to their email as opposed to linking it, keeping it offline, especially conversations offline, if it's particularly secure that you need to talk about. Always assume a chat can be compromised. So this doesn't always mean that there's an infiltrator that, wants to break down the movement. This could be that, someone has been able to, from, the government has gotten a warrant onto something, or maybe it means that someone left their phone or computer out and someone saw it. Or maybe it means that someone took a screenshot and it got sent out. There's a lot of different ways that information could be compromised. So just think about, being careful when you're posting anything that is a little bit riskier. Keep that offline. So we are going to send out this presentation afterwards. So this will be included in that, all of these calls. But folks want to screenshot this as well. Here's some accounts to follow. Feel free to share more in the chat if you have any good sources that you particularly like. There's a lot of folks on the ground in Gaza right now who are talking about this. There's a lot of organizations who, have been working to free Palestine long before the past few months. Follow those folks, those organizations, listen to their voices right now. I also really want to encourage folks to go to the bdsmovement.net website and learn a little bit more firsthand about what exactly the movement is and what it calls for from their voices. If we're informed about what the movement's calls are, we won't be disoriented or split whenever people throw inaccurate information out there, and we can share the actual truth with people as well. Also, get organized. So this is a really, really big one. As individuals, there's only so much that we can do. Our voice is so much more powerful when we work collectively. So, wherever you're at, I know this is a webinar, so there might be people logging on from all over the place. Get involved with a group that's near you. Palestinian Youth Movement is an international organization, so it's likely that, there might be a chapter near you. If you're a student, there's, SJP chapters, Palestine Solidarity Committee chapters. If you aren't Palestinian, you can get involved with an anti-imperialist org as well, a supporting org that support Palestinian organizers. So like the Dallas Anti-War Committee here in DFW, I'm sure there are ones near you as well. So get involved with other people, get connected, so that way we can build the people power behind this movement. Here's another one, another call to action that we would love if y'all could support. If you could sign this petition as well. So this is calling for the Dallas City Council to pass a resolution demanding a permanent ceasefire and an end to the US-backed Zionist genocide and occupation of Palestine. So you can read more about what exactly the wording of our resolution is in our petition here. Even if you don't live in Dallas, this is something that's helpful for us to, show that there's support even in other places, calling on Dallas City Council to do this. So actually, before we do that, we are now going to go into a question and answer section of this presentation. So feel free to keep sending questions in the chat. You can send them either in the general chat or you can address them directly to @questions. But any questions that we don't get to this evening in person, we're going to do our best to get through as many as we can. We will address in the follow-up email, as well as if we feel like there are resources or more information that we can share after the fact, we'll address those as well. But before we go into that, I just wanted to open up the floor one more time for Nida, if there is anything else that you would like to say before we do Q&A.
No, that's it. Thank you so much, Josh. I learned so much from your part of the presentation. So thank you so, so much. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Okay, I'll read out the first question that we have here. So regarding splitting and solidarity movements, what are strategies we can develop to diffuse these conflicts as they bubble up? So I'll start off with this one, and then Nida, feel free to take this as well. I think ultimately the way that we can combat splitting is by keeping our eyes and our focus on what our objective is. Our objective is stopping the genocide in Gaza. It's ending the occupation of Palestine. And it's all the material conditions that we're looking at. We're looking at the right to return for Palestinian refugees in the diaspora. We're looking for the right for all people in Palestine to live regardless of, religion or ethnicity or anything, for indigenous people, all the Palestinians, to be able to be back in their homeland, have national sovereignty over their homeland. It's all of these material concerns that we're looking to address. So keeping our eyes focused on what our goals are, what the goals of the movement are, keeping collective, organized focus on that, because ultimately these other things, these splitting tactics are just distractions. When someone says to me, why are you supporting the Palestinian movement as a queer and trans person? They would kill you in Gaza right away. That's not a true statement. That's a lie that is Islamophobic and, false. But the purpose of that statement is to try and stop me focusing on the genocide. And ultimately, if we're keeping our eyes focused on that, yes, people in every culture around the world have worked to break down the patriarchy, have worked to break down queer and transphobia. And here in the US, queer and trans people are murdered. And so I think that, painting it as if countries that have people with brown skin in them are inherently hateful to queer and trans people, but we somehow live in this magical utopia, that's all false. But ultimately, it's a distraction. And that's the purpose, is it's distracting us from our goals. So yeah, I have things you to say on that about how we can especially combat like those splitting tactics.
No, I think you covered it. Thank you so much, Josh. Do you mind if I take the second question?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer this, but I think that it's a little bit complex or a little bit hard for me to fully grasp. But what is the reason why Starbucks isn't an official boycott target? So, and if anyone here has more knowledge than me, would like to chime in, please feel free in the chat. But my understanding is that the official boycott list has certain companies that directly benefit from the occupation. So what that means is, in the case of HP, they provide technology for surveillance, or Puma, who provides the jerseys and the jerseys for the Israeli soccer team. And because of this idea that Josh mentioned or discussed in depth of targeted boycotts, they keep it limited to a list of targeted companies. And they work on targeting these companies for years at a time. So most recently, Puma announced that they will no longer be continuing their partnership with the Israeli soccer team starting, I think, next year, whenever this current contract ends, right? What's important to keep in mind is that this was actually a years in the making of campaigning against Puma, of speaking with Puma, of targeting their leadership, right? So for the BDS list, they tend to focus on companies that again benefit directly from Israeli occupation. So SodaStream itself is an actual Israeli company, and I think they have manufacturing facilities on occupied territory, right? So those sort of companies are the companies that BDS chooses to target. And again, this list is not exhaustive, but because of the idea of targeted boycotts being the most efficient and effective ones, that's why they keep it limited here. Now, my understanding is that Starbucks became like people began talking about Starbucks in the past few months because of the company's response to a post made by the workers unions of Starbucks, which was in support of Palestine. And I think that Starbucks, the parent company, actually attempted to associate them and make claims of them supporting terrorism, and attempted to sue them. I think there might be an ongoing lawsuit. I'm not fully sure what the legal status of that is, but so that is one of the primary reasons that Starbucks has come under fire over the past few months. And so that is what Josh described as an organic boycott, right? It's a boycott that the people have come together, saw what Starbucks's response was to its union workers, and then saw, like somebody mentioned in the chat, I think the parent company that like owns most of Starbucks actually has given money to the IDF before. So people have done their research, have found these pieces of information. They're like, we're going to come together and we're going to boycott Starbucks on the BDS list or not. It's become a popular demand over the last few months. And that's why I encourage us like wholeheartedly to adhere to the organic boycott calls that may not necessarily be on the BDS list. But hey, if everyone around you is boycotting Starbucks because they suck, for a lot of different reasons, by the way, we should probably boycott Starbucks, right? So I think that's the reason why. I hope that makes sense. But the BDS list is never going to be like a full exhaustive list, but and that's for the sake of having specific targets, and then furthermore, like we should be supporting organic boycotts. I'll mention one more example. So McDonald's, for example, became on the organic boycott list because of McDonald's franchises or the franchise in Israel supporting providing meals to the IDF as they are, slaughtering people in Gaza. So that is one of the reasons why. Okay, I'll stop talking there. Again, I hope that makes sense. The next question is a follow-up question. Follow-up question, does it apply in other countries like Taiwan? I don't consume Starbucks, McDonald's, etc., but I saw that Carrefour is also on the list. But what if Carrefour in Taiwan is Taiwanese funded? I'm not sure how it works. I could take this one as well if you don't mind. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I have just something brief that I can say on both of these topics is that, Nida was absolutely, great on explaining the organic boycott targets. And I just wanted to mention that if folks go to the BDSmovement.net website, it talks a lot more directly from the organizers of that movement about why they chose or didn't choose certain targets. So I think that one thing that's really important is that, this top left category, consumer boycott targets, that those are the primary targets that, like Nida was talking about, sorry, are selected for a reason, like HP being responsible for doing a lot of the, telecommunications and computing infrastructure for the checkpoints throughout the West Bank. So these are concrete things that, the movement has outlined. The organic boycott targets, absolutely, boycott Starbucks as well, but don't let those get in the way of what the BDS movement has said are, the key boycott targets that can help to put some direct pressure on the move or on the Zionist entity. And just briefly on the next question, to kind of not quite answering it, but around it, is these calls kind of look a little different from country to country. So for example, there was a call for a general strike a while back. In the US, the conditions are not quite right for a large general strike to have those material impacts. Still, participate if you're interested and able, but in countries like Jordan, large swaths of the country were shut down on that broad strike day. And that is something that, halted the flow of trade, that really materially impacted the country. So these calls might look different from place to place, depending on what the material conditions look like, what the organization looks like, all of these kinds of things. And then Nida, yeah, if you have thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, Josh. And I'll just add on is that I think like in the case of like McDonald's and Starbucks, I have seen that it's like folks worldwide are boycotting them. I think the idea is that even if something is like franchised in Taiwan and therefore like technically on a local level owned by a Taiwanese entity or individual, it still goes towards the benefit of the parent corporation, right? So that's why a lot of these corporations are being boycotted globally. And just some interesting news that I saw, but I think that Starbucks officially closed all of its locations in Morocco. So that just goes to show that global targeted boycotts, when they're done like in large number and for a specific purpose, work. And I won't get too much into that, but again, like even the example of Puma, it's pretty powerful that they have decided not to renew their contract. But okay, I think okay, the next question is sorry. Okay, what are some recommendations of ways to bring sympathetic but politically unengaged individual into this struggle? That's a great question, actually. Josh, do you want to get started? And that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. This, I think, is really key. I think right now there are a lot of people who, for the first time, are learning more about Palestine, for the first time are starting to get involved in this movement or interested in this movement. And I think right now is really, really important for us to be having these conversations, talking with our friends, our families, our coworkers, people online, sharing. I think, what I was saying earlier about connecting things to calls to action, I think is helpful, because it's a way of getting people involved actively in the movement. So they're not just, occasionally seeing, a video from Bisan on their TikTok, or they're not just occasionally seeing your post about, what you think about Palestine on Instagram. They're seeing it connected to, oh, I can learn more about this boycott, or I can go to this, teach-in like things tonight. And I think that, ultimately this educational side of it is really important right now in the moment. A lot of the general American public, especially folks who aren't Palestinian, aren't Arab, are coming into this from very ignorant positions. There's not been a lot of media representation about the Palestinian story, and people are coming into this with, very different levels of experience and knowledge. I think that it's really, our job to help to, spread that information, to better inform people, to get them connected and involved, and get involved with an organization, because organizations can work together to, build up this movement, build up structure, keep people engaged, and it's not just kind of as the media pulls one way or another. But those are some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's really great. And I'll add just a little bit to that. I second everything that Josh is saying. Like, political education is how we get people to want to take, the feelings that they have and turn it into something productive, right? Because I think a lot of people come from a place of feeling disempowered, right? So a key here, and I'll specifically speak to a pattern we see in the Arab and Muslim community, is we see a lot of fear culture around being involved politically. So while they may be pro-Palestine at home, they are afraid to be involved outwardly because of some of the stuff that Josh discussed, actually, like state repression and surveillance, etc. So our role really is to dismantle fear culture, right? Is to engage in conversation with our friends and families and classmates and coworkers and make them feel like it's okay to talk about these things. And like Josh said, invite them out to things, right? Like if you're going to a protest, you know that your friend hasn't been to a protest before, invite them to come with you. It might be intimidating to enter these spaces, and it's our job to make these spaces safe spaces for growth, for learning, for political education, and most importantly is dismantling fear culture that most of the time is a primary reason why people are afraid to be involved. But thank you again, Josh. Everything you said was perfect. I think
I can read the next one out.
thank you so much.
So, how do we combat the argument that nationality is being lost with the support of Palestine? I've seen many comments on Instagram posts where people condemn protesters for infiltrating cultures. That's what X gets for allowing Y into their country. Nida, do you want to start? Do you have thoughts on that?
I'm actually not fully I'm not sure I fully understand. I would like the person who asked the question to clarify though. My sincerest apologies, if that's okay. Or if Josh, maybe you have a better idea of what they're talking about.
Yeah, I agree if the, commenter would like to add some more clarity. I'm not sure if this is quite what is being said here, but my thought is that it's talking about, sort of people who aren't Palestinian getting involved in Palestinian organizing work. Like, is there space for people to get involved in this movement if they're not Palestinian? That's my thought. Do you have thoughts on that question, Nida?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we think of the Palestinian issue from an internationalist lens, right? Our struggle, our oppression is interconnected to the oppression of all marginalized people. And therefore, that necessitates a global movement, right? Our struggle is not just for the Palestinian people. And while we want to always be centering Palestinian voices and Palestinian revolutionaries, right? And keeping Palestinian people at the core of what we do, I don't think that means that we push non-Palestinians out. Again, this is from an internationalist lens when we think about this. I mean, imperialism impacts other communities, not just Palestinians, right? So it's important for us to understand that it's the duty of everyone to fight for liberation for Palestine in the same way that it is our duty to call for the end of US imperialism wherever we see it manifesting, right? So I would say that this is a cause for, in the words of Ghassan Kanafani, Palestine is a cause for all revolutionaries, right? And there's space in this movement for everyone, and every marginalized community. We fight for them when we fight for Palestine. So that's just important. Like our liberation is interconnected. When we fight for Palestine, we fight for the liberation of all oppressed peoples, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to briefly share a personal anecdote. I've spent the past number of years in particular helping a lot with Filipino organizing work. And I myself am not Filipino. And when I first was starting to get involved in that work, I think I was struggling, with a lot of I was struggling with a lot of, those questions about, am I, allowed to be a part of this? What is my role here? And, one of the lead organizers that was sort of bringing me into it, really expressed that it is, all of our jobs to be fighting against, imperialism, against racism, against all of these forms of oppression, because they impact all of us. And a non-Palestinian or as a non-Filipino in, that case, it is, part of my job is sharing the work alongside Filipino organizers, not leaving all of the work to, Filipinos, or in this case to Palestinians, and saying, oh, y'all go and do this organizing work on your own. I'll support it by showing up. It's our job to step up to the plate and not overshadow, not get in front of Palestinian organizers at all, but to do some of that work, some of that labor, some of that organizing, some of that planning, to take some of that burden off as well. So that's, just an anecdote as well.
Thank you so much, Josh. So just a quick time check. We do have 4 minutes left, so I think we can fit in a few more questions. So somebody asked if this recording will be made accessible to folks, and I'm actually not too sure, Josh.
Yes.
Will it be? Okay.
Yes, so we are live streaming right now on the Dallas Anti-War Committee Facebook page. So if you, look up Dallas Anti-War Committee on Facebook, that will stay up, as well as we'll be sending out this presentation for the slides and the information as well for people through email. If you fill out the form that people have been dropping in the chat with the discussion questions, that's how we'll get people's emails.
And then I think one final question here is, can Zionism be considered religious extremism? I would refrain from framing it in that lens, because I do think that it kind of feeds into the Zionist idea that this is a religious conflict, as in Islam against Judaism, and as if Zionism is inherent to the Jewish faith. But I think that's not true at all, of course, and perhaps making that that conflation can be anti-Semitic within itself. I think that whether there are Zionist Jewish people who are conservative Jewish people that are Zionist, that sure, that exist, but I would refrain from framing it as religious extremism, and for the reasons that we kind of already mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that Zionist is really a political ideology that came to life in the 1800s. And again, thinking about the historic, the late 1800s, thinking about the historic time frame there, what's going on around the world is we're seeing, the British Empire colonize the world, and through colonialism and imperialism rise to the top, and we see European hegemony, right? So that's where it comes from. It's really at its root a settler colonial project to gain power, and I don't think that has any roots necessarily in the Jewish faith. So for the sake of having more productive conversations, I think refraining from like talking about it as a form of religious extremism is probably the best. Josh, did you want to add anything?
I think that you absolutely answered that very well. It is a political, ultimately fascist, settler colonial imperialist plan. And I think that, the only other thing I want to mention on that is I think the framing sometimes of religious extremism, similar to the framing of words like terrorism, they come out of this post 9/11 Islamophobic sort of mindset in a lot of ways. And I think that it's not always useful to use that framing, that kind of narrative when we're talking from our perspective of, trying to dismantle these structures. We're not wanting to kind of parrot, the George Bush talking points in reverse kind of thing, because we're looking to, stop this imperialist project ultimately.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Josh. I think we're good to call it a night, actually. I hope that everybody answered the discussion questions we had. If we could drop the link just one more time in the chat, if that's okay. So that we can, get folks' emails as well and share this with you guys. Josh, is there anything else to add before we wrap it up?
Thank you all so much for taking, an hour and a half out of your evening to, join us on this. I'd really encourage you to, pay attention to those calls to action, learn more about the BDS movement, go to protests near you, come to educational events, all of these kinds of things to keep the momentum going. We don't want this to end tonight. We don't want this conversation to stop right now. There's so much more that we can learn about this. So thank you all so much.
Thank you guys. Have a great night.